race-based or religious-based identity. So there's a great departure. So we will come back to all these issues later. Should I give to you or to present it to speak? I know you'll be willing to take even the first, but I want you to wait for some time. Now we will have Mark Batra.
I think it's a good topic to discuss in a political science forum, and where
slowly, otherwise
that flow will be there. But it's a good topic to discuss. And I could understand that the topic that you selected is quite a polemic in nature. India is a polemic society, which in any kind of a case we tend to go to the extreme. We don't seem to have a balanced view as to how the situation is probably developing at any point of time in any context. And that is how I think when you start talking of majoritarianism, it's like taking a position whether India is going for majoritarianism or India is going in a different direction. And I think the moment we select a topic, if we start taking a position, it seems to be throwing out the rationalism out of the window, and where you probably already force the audience to take a position that probably India is going for majoritarianism. But in my view, I think as a student of political science, when you look into our own constitution, we know that the preamble seems to be talking about India being a social, being a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic state. Socialism is something we talk about differently, but the preamble tends to have created a kind of a scenario for the government of the post-independent India to carry on its task of governance towards the benefit of all. I think Professor Srikanth talked of many things which are very important, and I think when he is referring to Gandhi has come up as a very, very sudden development to us. I think most of the Indians, irrespective of the geographical location that we may be residing in, we probably do not understand Gandhi in the real sense of the term. When Professor Srikanth was talking about when Jinnah was asked to become the Prime Minister of the country and it could have united India, and that is also not known as to whether Jinnah accepted and Jinnah didn't say yes or no, and also whether he would have accepted and India could have remained a united country. But nonetheless, my conclusion is here that we always refer to Gandhi when it suits us, when we forget Gandhi when it doesn't suit us. But I think Gandhi still remains a kind of a mysterious figure for us, where Gandhian thought like Marx. When you say the Marx is different from the so-called Marxism that is being understood by the world today. Marx was much larger world view than what the so-called leftist communist of the Soviet Union tend to have encapsulated it into the so-called philosophy. So if Marx was alive, Marx would have not probably identified with the kind of Marxian principles that the Soviet communists tend to have opted in for. Same with the Gandhi. I think whenever we refer to Gandhi, we still seem to be referring to Gandhi in a very, very partial sense, and we don't understand as to what Gandhi really had in mind. But the greatness of Gandhi lies in the fact that Gandhi respected all religions. Gandhi said that let your windows are closed. Gandhi said open up all the windows of a room, let all the winds from all ideas of all religion flow through the room. So that shows that Gandhi was a unifying factor in terms of religious beliefs that were present in India. The other difficulty that India seems to be having is probably we know that although we were very excited in 1947, we got independence, and the independence struggle was primarily led by the so-called elites, the elite sections of the society, which primarily composed of Anglicized, Western educated elites, and who were also engaged in the so-called Western professions of, they were lawyers, they were intellectuals. And the so-called poor people that you say, the vast majority of the Indians probably did not participate or did not come to the limelight as the elites seem to have hogged the limelight. So there was a kind of a divide in between the elite and the so-called common people in India. And as far as gaining independence is concerned, the values that were motivating the so-called Western elites to fight for independence, and also their adoption of the Westminster style of government for India, which was totally at variance with the beliefs of the common people. And although if you have looked at the celebration of India's independence, you'll find the celebrations were largely confined to the metro and the urban areas, the cities, rather than in the villages. I've never heard that the villagers really celebrated India's independence, because for them the story, not only the story was different at that point of time, and if you talk of today in the context of majoritarianism, the story also remains the same. There is a kind of a great divide which has continued between the elites and the masses, where the terms which are being used by the so-called Western elites tend to be rather guided by the Western considerations. I think Srikanth was right when he said that Indian secularism is different from Western secularism. While Western secularism wanted equidistance, India was kind of a equal closeness, with it say in Sanskrit, the Sarva Dharma Samabhava, that they will view all religions as equal, and they will not make any discrimination as far as the practices by the religious followers are concerned. So that way Indian secularism was very, very unique in the sense that although they were not trying to maintain a distance, but they were trying to provide scope for all the religious communities to grow as long as they can grow. I think we all believe that human beings are organisms. They grow to the extent that they are genetically programmed, and that is how all the religions should have the opportunities to reach the side of excellence, the stage of excellence, as they are bound to be. So that way, and the other problem that we have in India is that we find that not only the elite and as far as religious differences are concerned, we also find there is also the elite-urban divide, and this elite-mass divide has perpetuated in all circles of life in the post-independent India. I think today, when you refer to any kind of a term that is used to describe the situation, you find that that term is probably far removed from the reality as it is found in the villages. I think when you talk of the villages, they are not only filled up with poverty, they are filled up with a lot of filth and a lot of injustice, a lot of discriminatory practices, where we find that the communities, irrespective of religion, tend to look forward to a kind of an effective governance, which they have not seen in the post-independent India. I think Congress, when you talk of the in political science, we know that how being a one-party dominant system, the political system of India has moved to what you call it one-party-led system now. So there are differences where I think although the critics tend to be characterizing India, the BJP as trying to go for an opposition-free India, but the idea is that if political parties are in the profession of seeking people's consent to be elected to be able to form government, it's only because that the politics that we follow in the case of Western model is a kind of a competitive politics. I think when you go back to little bit to the story of the post-independent India, we find that the elites seem to have opted for the so-called Westminster form of government simply because they were very familiar with the Westminster form of government, they were very familiar with the Westminster form of democracy, and which was again not being liked by the common people here. And you find that the so-called westernized kind of a governance is an imposition on the people rather than what they would have liked for. I think we all had a traditional system of governance which, despite certain weaknesses, they have been functioning rather well, and that probably would have promised them the kind of governance and the kind of benefits that they were looking forward to as human beings. I think the other thing that when you come to the post-independent India, you find that the post-independent India was confronted with the challenge of what you call it two kind of very important challenges. One is nation building, the other one is state building. I think when the Eurocentric state system was being imposed in India, and when the traditional systems were being demolished by the so-called colonialists, they found that the state building was not complete simply because that people were trying to discover what is this Eurocentric state system, how it tends to require a kind of a set pattern of behavior on the part of the people in order to be able to be effective in promising the kind of governance which probably any society may be looking forward to. So I think when you talk of state building, I think the state building started was an unfinished task, and then it was continued by the so-called Western elites in the post-independent India, where the state started marching deep into the human societies in terms of making people familiar with the kind of governance system and the kind of benefit that can accrue to them provided they remain part of the so-called state system. The other one, we talk of nation building. I think India has been categorized as a multinational state. We know that all of we are nations. We had our own practices, on social and other kind of religious practices, which we are autonomous in our own thing, and there was nothing like of a kind of a uniformity that was expected at that point of time. I think the nation building activities tend to have mandated the Indian state to go in for a practice of what is called Srikanth referred to national integration. But national integration is a process where probably it was not a kind of a compulsory process, but it was a process which was promised to people by the Indian state that probably people would be able to assimilate their practices, where they would be able to reach what is called the stage of development, then remain out of it. I think the state of, and then if you talk of the state building and the national building, the other difficulty that Indian state faced in the post-independent India was the, what you call it in our own discipline, uneven spread of capitalism. I think if you talk of secularism, secularism is primarily capitalist values, and we all know how these kind of values that have been preached to us by the so-called Western colonialists were totally in consonance with the Western capitalist model of development or Western capitalism than our own economic development. We know that our development was not nothing compared to the Western capitalism, which they had started, attaining from the times of industrial revolution. So I think this, when you bring in the Western capitalism, we find that the state was marching into people's life. The state was trying to depend its own involvement with the people in terms of the various national integration programs, which it was launching, every year over a period of time. And we also find that the state was also engaging in developing certain institutions, which probably would be able to enable the so-called Indian state to provide a kind of a good governance. I think, and when you talk of these institutions, we primarily understand the political institutions. I think when you talk of the political stability was also not very much familiar to the Indians, because the institutions were, and if you see from 1949, when the independent politics started, with the first election, you find how the governments were not very stable. So unstable governments tend to not rather assert its own strength in terms of bringing about effective policies, which may or may not be liked by the whole population. I think, if you talk of the so-called majoritarianism, that problem comes up simply because that we find, I'm not a supporter of BJP, but we as students of political science, we need to call a spade, and we need to see where the governance has really made its meaningful entry into the human lives, and how it is trying to alter the kind of otherwise a stagnant scenario, which is probably leading us towards a kind of a transformative stage. And here, if you talk about BJP, I think certain of the action that the BJP government has taken probably has somehow affected the religious minorities, primarily the Muslim majority, the Muslim minority, who constitutes something like 17% of the India's population. And what is interesting is that when people, the BJP government has been criticized for bringing in NRC, for bringing in CA, for dissolving the Jammu and Kashmir state and making them into administrative units, union territory, and also for bringing in the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, and also trying to probably demand certain things which have worked to the detriment of the religious minorities. But then these actions, as you understand, if you look at Indian society, Indian value systems, when you talk of Hindu, I think Srikant, I like one line that Srikant muttered in our own group from the so-called Western anglicized lexicon, Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. I think Indian society still doesn't understand what is Hindi, what is Hindustan, and what is a Hindu. Because if you talk about a Hindu, I think Indian history books have been written by again the Western elites, which do not speak of the reality that we have gone through. I think most of the presentations of the facts have been westernized. People who have whosoever we had our own professors who were teaching us history, but we understand they seem to be propagating the so-called Western values or Russian values as was the Soviet communism as they were influenced with. And there we find that when you talk about a Hindu today, we find that Hindu is a word which has come from the word Sindhu, and India was located along the banks of the river Indus, Sindhu. So that is how, and when the English could not pronounce the word Sindhu, they call it Hindu. So that is how people living on this side of the path became Hindu. But there was nothing like, they might have had a common religion which later on discovered, but they first that this area is called Hindu, instead of Sindhu, and that is how we find that that is how these people came to be known to be Hindu. But then this place, when you use Hindi, because we use a particular word, they call it a place. So they place because where they place this side of the rivers Indus, where this population was staying, they were called Hindustan because Stan is a place. So that way, and it is quite natural that you will identify place and identify people, and when you identify certain people, you hardly have any motive to show them negatively or to bring about the negativity to the picture. So when you talk about this, and what is this Hindu, as you know, when the people were living together in religion, they had one sense of common values which tends to be representative of the nation, and that is how I think there was a lot of commonality which was involved with. But later on, what happens that you find that when the so-called and Christianity entered into Indian society on the riding piggyback on Western colonialism, and that's where you find that the biggest ever danger that Christianity might have posed to the people is to demolish their own traditional institutions. I think most of the institutions which are followed by the so-called our own friends in the Northeast are supposed to be believed in, supposed to be based on animism, and animism had its own significance. But then, as the Christianity came through, it destroyed all the animist beliefs and tried to impose their own ideas on the people, and that's where they also sowed this kind of a seed of divide that look, they belong to different religion, you belong to different religion, so you be there. This is something that has happened also in the Western societies. I think the religious before the entry of Christianity into the country, I think the conflicts that were there was very few, or even negligible if you say, or even nil in certain parts. But this religious divide which has come into being, and this continuation of the colonial beliefs in the so-called postmodern state structures tend to be very prominent. I think when you talk of the political parties' way of functioning, we find that that no political party has been free from the influence of any kind of religion. I think whenever the political parties tend to, and we know our own functional political parties, they seem to be not based on performance. They seem to be still devoting their attention on narrow ethnic factors, which probably they think will be able to bring people to their fold rather than being tested on the basis of their programs and policies. I think most of the failure of the Indian political system is simply because the political parties, instead of being performance-led, they have become almost like ethnic factor-led, and where they seem to be not have promised the kind of effective governance. I think when you compare the Congress and the BJP government today, you'll find that BJP rose from only 2 members right up to 264. Then it has now crossed the 300 marks. And and if you agree with the fact that people have elected BJP to rule the country in the so-called democratic India, then I think blaming the voters who have voted for the party belonging to any particular religion would be a kind of a great blunder, because people must have voted the party because of the bankruptcy of the political beliefs of the parties belonging to the left and also to the center. I think the center BJP is BJP is a centrist party, but mostly the Western media tends to categorize them as a right-wing Hindu nationalist party. And sometimes in the foreign forums, we tend to ask, when Germany, being a Christian majority state, and Germany has a Christian Democratic Party, how doesn't it make the Christian Democratic Party in Germany a right-wing nationalist party, and you tend to categorize BJP as a right-wing Hindu nationalist party? If you listen to BJP and all these Western educated media platforms and the followers, they will be all the time categorizing the BJP as a right-wing Hindu nationalist party. I do not understand that just because the followers tend to be, BJP also has followers from people belonging to other religions. It's not a kind of a one religion dominant party, but the Western terminology seems to be categorizing us into some kind of a straitjacket categories, which tends to give us a different meaning. The other problem is the so-called Western elites, which we tend to appreciate whatever is spoken from the Western media. I think when the Amnesty International criticizes the Indian government policies, we get very happy. When UN bodies tend to criticize during this NRC and C agitation, we became very happy that UN criticized. When the US International Committee on Religious Freedom criticized the Indian government policy on NRC, we also become very happy. But the problem is that when you talk of Indian governance and Indian ethos, they are very unique. They are more different from what the Western ethos stand to be. Indian state can never reach up to the level of Western state as it has achieved its excellence so far. I think this is what is taught in modernization theory. Nobody is considered to be modernized until we live up to the standard of or expectation of the Western civilization. I think that is where I often ask my students. I said, when our own cultural ethos are very nice, when our own traditional dress makes our boys and girls about to get into a marital relationship look much more handsome than wearing in a suit and a gown. Why don't we please adopt our own custom? Why should we have to wear a Western coat and also that jacket, that ladies' bridal gown, which probably is more expensive and unaffordable by the poor? So some of the other, this kind of we tend to have adapted the culture because we are told that until you wear a suit, you You are not treated to be a kind of a gentleman, a modern person. So the idea is that when you talk about it, we seem to be we should need to understand that and when you come to the government policies, I think the BJP government shows its strength in terms of bringing about certain changes which the political system was crying for, was needed. Although when you talk of the NRC, it might have it has put the Muslim women primarily into difficulties, where 2 billion Muslim women had to go here and there, and some people were detention. But then the NRC is a move which probably which has also been demanded by the Congress and implemented by BJP. Most of the policies that the BJP has implemented seem to have originated in the Congress psyche, in the Congress mindset. And the CA also is not something new, but then the problem is that because the Western media tends to call BJP a Hindu party, BJP practicing majoritarianism and trying to, what Hockey was saying, I know that they are trying to say, no, it's not a civic nationalism, it's a ethnic nationalism. But I don't know whether the nationalism that India adopted for was at all based on civic nationalism is yet to be debated. Because the point is, whatever the Western said, we copied it out of the textbook. I think some way or the other, I think if you look at our own Indian society today, I do not see that there is any kind of a polarization which is taking place. Yes, there could have been some arousal feelings, but that is natural because the fact that we are in a competitive politics, political parties tend to compete with each other in terms of being able to mobilize voters to their side, and also the political parties are also aiming at securing power, not really trying to reform or transform our own societal difficulties that we may be having. So I think, and all this kind of majoritarianism, or if you talk of polarization, this is only because that the Western elites, the so-called westernized educated elites of India, who have gone to English medium schools and colleges and universities, tend to have been in great danger simply because they think that if the real empowerment of the poor people will take place, probably we will be losing our bread and butter. And I think if you have studied the COVID time, you will see that the wealth of the rich has increased manifold than the poor. So I don't know whether you have questioned this particular to your consciousness, that how did the rich get so much money and what happened to the poor? So I think any political party which responds to the needs and the demands of the poor people, irrespective of the religious differences, since they are all trying to garner votes of the people across the religious categories, I think here and that move should not be categorized in a negative manner as is being categorized by the Western elites and by the Western societies. And we need to rather, if there have been some kind of deficiencies in our own governance system, then we rather better to work for it rather than merely, rather than become a part of the ape society that we have been so far. I think, and we must also remember that a strong government can only bring about a strong, can build up a better society rather than a weak government. I think when you remain focused on BJP, if any other party also tends to come in its place, this so-called nationalism that you talk about, I think when you talk about nationalism is not all that bad. Where you appeal to build up your own nation. The nationalism that also is being propagated to us is also again westernized kind of a interpretation. They seem to be saying if India becomes stronger, then probably Western will become weaker. I think thanks to the so-called Indian people, their consensus that they have reposed on the Indian government today, that the India is now becoming a world power. I think that is how we wrote somewhere that in 2 weeks 5 foreign ministers of 5 developed states paid a visit to India. And today also I also read that India has been invited by Germany to the G7 meeting, which was beyond India's comprehension. India is not a G7 or G8 country. So if India's position has risen, it's only because that the government, despite some policies, it has been able to keep the flock. I know there is a level of violence in some places, but that's something else to discuss. But we should remember that whatever is happening in India, if the Western societies tend to categorize India in a negative manner, it's only because they are wary of their loss of power and esteem in the world today. And India, with India's rise to the world esteem, I think the country can become much more prosperous and better governed than what it is today. Thank you.
Just I said, he knows everything under the sun. If I happen to be his examiner, I don't know whether I'll give him 7 or 3 marks.